Sometimes it's just fun to pull a pile of fabric out, put it on the table, and see what you can do with it. Maybe pull some ideas, some favorite blocks, maybe a pattern or maybe not. This was without a pattern. This was just throwing some triangles together, finding some different sizes, and of course low volume fabrics and charm squares and scraps and a little bit of everything. And it's fun to come up with a quilt this way. I'm Lea Louise from Inspired Quilting by Lea Louise, and I want to share this with you and give you some ideas how to come up with your own designs and thoughts and be able to put it in fabric and actually create it and put it together. If you look at this quilt behind me, it's a Scrappy quilt, it's a flying geese quilt, but there's just some fun, interesting aspects that makes it super simple. Those alternating rows mean there's no matching squares. That's one of my favorite techniques to use in a simple, fast quilt. I think you're really going to enjoy this. So let's get started. But first I need to share with you, I found a quilt calculator online in order to figure out your flying geese block sizes, and it's fantastic. It's the best one I've seen. So that link is going to be down below. I don't want you to miss that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I've been having fun learning how to design quilt layouts on the computer, and this is one that I did. I wanted to do some flying geese, but do it with charm squares. So these are 5-inch squares, and these are 5-inch, approximately, I think they're 2 1/4 by 4.5 inch flying geese is what they end up being. But I wanted to do low volume fabrics in the background. Now I didn't fill these in because it just was a lot of time and effort. I just wanted to get the general idea of it. But what I want to explain to you is, in making this quilt, I wanted it to be very, very simple. And by doing this with the alternating rows of charms, we don't have all these extra points to match up along the way. And while I was doing this, I also offset these rows a little bit so these seams don't line up either. So I'm going to show you the final quilt here in just a moment, and I just want you to take a look at that and see how easy this layout can be. Here's how the quilt turned out, and I really like it. I think it would be great fun in a super large quilt. When I do something for the first time, I generally do it on a small scale, just to get a feel for it and see how it works and what I need to modify and change. Now, there are 2 more rows. So this row up here and this row, they're just little bits there. So the whole thing isn't showing, but I really like how this turned out. You can see how by offsetting these blocks at the end of the rows and switching them up a little, it then allows these seams to fall sort of randomly throughout. There's an occasional spot or two where they actually, you know, hit a block, but for the most part, there's no matching seams, which makes this so simple. And the other thing is that you can make these any size that you want, and I have some great information I want to share with you on that too. Just for fun, I created a coloring page as well. Now this is something that you can download. I will put the link down below in the description, and this will just be kind of fun to give you an idea of designing a quilt and placing colors and choosing different layouts and what you can do with it. And sometimes just having a page like this to work with gives you a bit of inspiration about making your own quilt, because this isn't a pattern and we don't need a pattern to put this together. That's the beauty of this. All right, I want to show you what the quilt looks like finished. And here's a quick look at all 7 rows. And I really like the alternating pattern with the blocks in between. And I put in some batiks just to add some color. And I just think it's a lot of fun. It's a Scrappy quilt, which is what I like. There's a lot of color, a lot of patterns. The different size blocks make it really interesting. And I enjoyed making this, and I think this is something that's very easy. It's a fun way to work with flying geese, and it's a fun way to change up your quilting style and try some different ideas. If you're interested in more Flying Geese ideas, there's also a link down below for 15 free patterns. They're Flying Geese patterns by various fabric designers, and they're all free. And I think there's some really fun selection in there, and you may find something you like, so check that out. You know I'm in heaven when I'm surrounded with low-volume fabrics. They're probably one of my favorites to quilt with because I love how they make a wonderful, wonderful background. And the bright prints and other batiks and flowers that I put in there just bounce off so well of these low volume fabrics. So this is where we are, and this is where we're starting. Step back a couple weeks and you remember this quilt here, the Flying Geese quilt. This was the free Moda pattern, and I love how this turned out. This was with about a half dozen of the low volumes, which I thought came out really nice. But I want to use a ton of low volume, make some slightly smaller Flying Geese, and totally change the layout. So I'm really excited about this. And I wanted to show you something else that I found that I'm pretty pleased with. Here's the fabric that I've had tucked away forever. And I wanted to use it as a low volume. It's particularly bright. Now, I have actually washed this a number of times, even with a bit of bleach, just to try and fade it out. And there's still more here than I would want on a low volume, but with bright fabrics, I think it would work. I'm either going to use this as a backing or slice and dice it for some low volume. I haven't decided yet. But, take a look at some of the fabrics you have and see what you can come up with for some great ideas for a new project. Now, as you remember with this project that we did, that quilt with the Flying Geese, we used the no waste method, and that's what I'm using today, but again, on a smaller scale. And you saw how I cut my fabrics. I use fat quarters. I buy just about everything in fat quarters. Occasionally I'll get yardage, and sometimes it's charm square or layer cake, but I find I can cut my own and just have plenty on hand. So what I do, the first thing is I cut basically a 10-inch is usually what I cut. These I cut at 9 1/4 because that's what I needed for this particular size, and that's going to work out pretty well for this quilt. I'm going to cut it down a bit, but I'll have some nice strips, so I'll show you that in a minute. But when I cut my fat quarters, I generally do a 10-inch strip, a 5-inch, and then my scrap pieces, which run roughly 3 to 3.5 inches. So I always have these wonderful collections of semi-pre-cut fabrics. Now, in this case, I'm going to be using a lot of 5-inch squares, but I don't have to cut them at 5 inches in this quilt. I can make them longer. I can make them shorter. Oh my goodness, it is so flexible and so many choices. I'm going to show you all how that works. But here's another set of fat quarters I cut. This was the blue and green batik that I did, and I used a lot of these low volume fabrics in here. This is a 10-inch piece, so I am going to be using these 5-inch squares. I believe the 5-inch has already been cut, and they're around here somewhere, at least the ones that were left over from that quilt. So I just wanted to go over this to show you about staging your fabrics. If you have a pile of fat quarters that you're not using, cut them into a size that will be useful to you. Cut them into a size that makes them your go-to, so you don't have to worry about coming up short, or you always have fabric, or if you're missing something. So I've got some fat quarters here. Oh, and look at this. I also got this in the mail. More fat quarters. Life is good. Okay, let's see what we have. Fat Quarter Shop, they do their monthly fat quarter shipments and a variety of different options. And I chose the Hoffman Batiks. And this is called Coastal Mornings. And it's lavender, which I like, but look at all those low volumes in there. I will be pulling this out and doing some cutting on these fat quarters because I want those as a low volume. And these will be beautiful. I may even put some of these in the quilt as my flying geese. So many decisions to make. So let me get this all together and get started. I have my 5-inch squares that I've cut previously that are left over. I have some more fat quarters to work on, more 5-inch strips. Oh, and the little teeny tiny pieces. This quilt, we can even use the teeny tiny pieces. This is going to be wonderful. You'll love it. So let's get started. I have my low volume fat quarters laid out and I trimmed them up. So I think I've got about 8 of them here, and I pressed them, I stacked them, I lined them up with the raw edge here and the selvages on this side. And the first thing I did was trim this edge. You can see just a little bit of the little raw edges and a few things that were sticking out here and there. And then I cut my 10-inch strip. Now I actually cut it at 10 1/8. That way, if I'm doing triangles or flying geese or half square triangles, whatever the case may be, I have that little bit of fudge factor that really helps. And of course, I trim this bottom edge as well. Then my 5-inch strip, which I'm not going to cross cut. So all these I leave in their 20 to 22-inch length, whatever it is, because I don't want to cut it until I know exactly what I'm going to need. And so these I'm going to put aside. And I will be using some of these 5-inch lengths here. And then the end piece is generally going to be anywhere from 3 to 3.5 inches. Now you'll notice the longest ones with a fat quarter shop, when they cut their fat quarters, they generally go closer to 19 inches than 18. So I cut this at 3.5. So there would be my 18-inch right there. I get the 3.5, and then I still had some extra. So you get that little bit, which is nice, because sometimes when you get just exactly the 18-inch, you barely get that 3-inch. If you're going for 2.5-inch strips, it's not a problem, but I prefer to get more than less. So I'm going to set this aside because I can't use that. I will be using some of these. So let me go ahead and cut 2 sets of 5-inch squares. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll cut that one right at 5. Get it? Oh, there we go. And 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this is what I'm going to use also in the background. So I'm going to set those aside because we'll be using that. This I'll put aside. I can use it if I need it. But then, like I said, I cut this down to 3.5 inches, and actually 3.25 inches, sorry. And I'm going to trim off that little pinked edge, and I'm going to make some 3.25-inch squares. And I'll make 2 sets of them, 1, 2, 3.25. This is what I'm going to need for my, get on the quarter there, I can't find it. Let me go this way. 1, 2, 3.25. There we go. This is what I'm going to use for my flying geese background, the sky. And that's going to all be in the low volume. But I want to bring a little color in too, because that's just going to keep it extra interesting. And I like that. It just adds a bit of flair to your quilt. Okay, so these are going to be set aside for another day. These I'm ready to go. Now the other thing that I did is I took some 5-inch squares that I had and I cut them down to my 3 1/8. So the first thing I did is I stacked, I think there's 4 5-inch squares here. I cut it off at 3 1/8. So that left me, almost 2 inches, a good 1.75 inches. That'll easily be an 1.5 inch strip that I can use another time. And then I cross-cut this, and here's another good size piece. These actually were some that I set aside because they didn't quite measure 5 inches, so I don't have a problem cutting these, and now I have some great strips. And we may be able to use these in this quilt. I'm going to show you some ideas I have about how to use some of these, tiny bits in here. So we have the other square that we need. We have 5-inch squares, and we have our 3 1/8, and now we need some 6-inch squares. And so this is from the flying geese pattern that I made that I showed you earlier. And what I'm going to do is cut some 6-inch squares. Here are the charm squares, my pre-cuts that I have, all kinds of different pieces. Some are still in their long strips, others are cross-cut into the actual 5-inch, and I'll pull a bunch of these, and then I'm going to, like I said, we have our, what size is that? That's our 5-inch charm for the background. That'll be going in the alternating rows, and then we need 3 1/8 for the sky of the flying geese, and the 6-inch in order to make our flying geese. Now this is going to be a baby size quilt, so I'm not making a ton. There'll be about 35 flying geese in this quilt, but I did 10 squares, so I'll have 40. That gives me a few extra colors to choose from. So for 10 of these, I need 40 pieces of the 3 1/8. And then I'm going to need at least 36 for the first round, and then more. So I'm going to say it's going to be about 2 charm packs worth of low volume. But we can cut as we go, and we're going to use a ton of scraps. This is probably the closest I've come to ever making a real scrappy quilt. I generally pull in all the fat quarters, cut them up, and everything's nice and pristine, and don't have to go through, piles of stuff. Well, because I've been pre-cutting my fat quarters, I've gone through so many that I have, and I'm pre-cutting them into those sizes, I have a lot more to choose from, and I'm more apt to use those pieces. And now I know what sizes I want to keep. These are kind of my go-tos, a 10, a 5, and the strips. And that's what I predominantly use. But we're going to find out ways that we can use some of these little pieces in this quilt too. These are pieces that were too small for charm squares, but look at these. These are going to be my 3 1/8. So I can come through here and I can get a lot of that. Strips like this, oh, there's a lot we can do with that. That's for another day though. So let me go ahead and get some of this cutting done. I'm going to put together what our flying geese will look like. Oh, and then I need to show you a picture of what we're making. I think you're going to love it. We're having fun. I've been busy while you were away, and I have my flying geese made. I wanted to show you real quick how this goes together. I have a number of tutorials I've done recently, and I'll put some links above where you can see how to do the flying geese no waste method. It's a great way to do this. What I did want to show you though is here's one of the problems you need to watch out for. When I sew my first seam, I come down this side, make sure that this top piece is on top of this so that I'm sewing, the fabric doesn't flip over. I come around, I spin and come back the other direction, and you have to sort of get your stiletto, your seam ripper, pin, whatever the case may be, to hold that fabric, because sometimes it wants to bunch up. I started to tear it out, but then I thought I wanted to show you. But you can see how I have my center line, and I sewed a 1/4 inch on either side. Actually, I sewed just shy of a 1/4 inch, and that worked out well. A couple of things we need to talk about here that is a little bit contrary to what I've done in the past. I used a calculator online. I went to Patchwork and Poodles, and I'll put the link down below, because she has a wonderful calculator for determining your flying geese blocks from tiny to huge blocks. And you put in your finished size and you get your square size that you need. And I thought, okay, let me try this and see how it works. I don't always use the charts that are out there because, as I said, it's somebody else's math, and I always want to double check because you're dealing with fractions and you're adding anywhere from 7/8 to 1.25 inches to your block size. And you want to make sure that's accurate. So I always double check it, and it's just easier for me to do it myself. But in this case, I thought, all right, because I think this calculator is really neat. You need to check it out. It was quite impressive. Now, The other thing about these sheets, when you use the cheat sheets is what we call, or the chart, is that you need to know whether or not the individual making it rounded it to the next 1/4 inch, rounded it up to the next 1/4 inch, or left it as is. The reason being is sometimes you're dealing with something as minute as 1/8 of an inch, and that can get fussy when you're cutting quilt blocks. So generally, these are rounded up to the next size. When that happens, you may get a block a bit bigger than anticipated, which isn't a bad thing because it gives you room for trimming. So with all that said, my blocks came out a bit larger than I expected. I was going for a, let's see, a 4.5 by 2 and what is that? 3/4, I think. Or 2 1/4. And so these came out about 1/8 of an inch larger than what I need. So I can easily trim them down. But as I showed you originally in the pattern, the layout of this quilt is that there are 2 different strips that make up the quilt. There's a total of 5 strips or 5 rows, whatever way you want to determine that. 4 of them are just charm squares, and then 3 of them have the flying geese. So my plan was that all 5 rows or columns would be 5 inches wide and finish at 4.5. But since I'm dealing with a little bit larger, and rather than cutting and throwing it all away, I'm just going to make those rows a bit wider. So this is kind of being modified as we go, and I'm okay with that, but I just want to explain what to think about when you're making a block and using somebody else's table. There's nothing wrong with the table I used. It was wonderful. It was very accurate for what I was going for. It just was a bit large. Since these blocks are consistently larger all the way across, I can actually make this column of flying geese a little bigger than expected. I can certainly go through and trim them down, but that's not necessary because I can use them as they are. I went through and I double checked, and there's hardly any trimming that needs to be done. Most of these are right on, and that's what's great about this method. It's very, very accurate. So the way this quilt is set up, there are a total of, let's see, 3 and 4, 7 rows of charm squares and flying geese. And 4 of those are just the charm squares, and 3 are a combination of the flying geese and the charm squares. What I've decided I'm going to do, because I have the extra fabric, is I'm going to go ahead, instead of using charm squares here like I would between my flying geese, I am going to use some of these strips of fabric that I have and just cut them to the, I forget, are these 5.5 or 5 1/4? 5 1/4, to the 5 1/4 inches. And then once I, get everything done the same way, I'm going to have a nice strip. It'll all be even, and then I can piece them alternately with the charm square strips, and that's all going to work really well. So it's a little unusual the way I'm doing this, and that's why I'm trying to explain. I don't want you to shy away from flying geese, and I don't want you to think that you have to, when you come up with something that's unexpected, that you have to go in and cut it all down or tear it apart or change it, because there may be a way to use it. And that's what I've decided to do here. I made a modification, and it's okay to do. We made a decision to change our course, and the quilt is not going to look much different at all. It probably won't even be noticeable. It's a very, very small amount. So the other thing I want to show you, I'm going to finish this one up, and then I can sew my geese together. And I want to show you how the charm square rows are coming together. Now, remember I told you there's an opportunity to use a lot of smaller pieces. So I started with a lot of charm squares that I liked, but notice how I use narrow strips that are less than 5 inches. So I'd use a full 5-inch charm square, but then I would put these narrow pieces in. It's going to change it up a bit. It's going to add some interest. It adds a lot of different color and the size. You know, it's just kind of a fun and different way of doing it. And you know what the beauty of this is? There's no matching seams. These seams are not going to line up because everything is offset with different sizes. And the fact that these blocks are also going to be off by about 1/4 of an inch than expected, I'm not going to have to worry about those seams lining up. So this is going to finish so easy. So this was all a blessing, let me tell you. I love it when something goes a little unexpectedly and turns out to be a wonderful opportunity. So that's where we are. And I want to go ahead and I'm going to put this together. I'll get these rows done and I'll show you what that looks like. And then we'll put this all into one final quilt and we're going to be finished. This is really a very quick quilt. And I'm excited about it. I can't wait to see how it looks. This is definitely a scrappy quilt, no doubt about it. And here's another quick look at the finished quilt. I think it turned out wonderful. Now be sure to check the downloads. We've got the downloads for the free patterns that you can get from the fabric designers. We have the download for the printable coloring page if you're interested. And there's also the link to go to the Flying Geese calculator. So there's a lot down there I don't want you to miss. All right, so here we are, and I'm ready to get this quilt finished. I'm glad you were here with me today. It was fun to share, and as always, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.